Hello, testing.
Test.
Great. I think we're going to get started with our second session of the day here at day 3 of Wind Europe Bilbao. We've got a crowd gathered at the Global Markets Theatre just across the Global Wind Energy Council stand. And I believe we also have a crowd gathered online. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. A warm welcome to the GMT. Today we're going to be doing a short session this morning. It's a 30-minute session on combating disinformation, which is targeting the wind industry. And I'll set the context for this topic in just a little bit, because I do realize it's somewhat left of field for what's been on the main stage of the conference. Just to introduce myself, my name is Joyce Lee. I'm Head of Policy and Projects at the Global Wind Energy Council. And I'll introduce our two speakers who are with us, one virtually, one physically, in a few moments. I wanted to start, as noted, by putting this disinformation topic into context. GWEC has just published its Global Wind Report 2022. This is the biggest report we've ever done. It's the yearbook for the wind industry globally last year. And this outlines the global challenges and the enablers for the energy transition and for the industry. It also included the results of a survey and a piece of analysis we ran with industry associations around the world and our members, from the US to Brazil, Europe to South Africa, Vietnam to Australia. And what this survey found is that the top challenges which face the growth of wind energy globally are around system design and society. So much has already been said at this conference around the system design issues, around auction design, around pricing, around remuneration, but less has been said on building social consensus for the energy transition to proceed. And what that process looks like is rapid acceleration and rapid deployment. Under the shared net zero by 2050 targets and the 1.5 degree compliant pathways that have been mapped out by international energy authorities like the IEA and IRENA, we need to accelerate annual wind installations by 4 times within this decade. Right now, we're on track to reach cumulative installations of just less than 2,000 gigawatts by the end of 2030. And that's only 2/3 of where we need to be by 2030 to meet a net zero pathway. So scaling up wind by 4 times isn't going to be a guaranteed smooth road when it comes to social acceptance and when it comes to the symptoms of social opposition, including legal challenges and overly delayed permitting timelines. We know that renewable energy enjoys broad public support. We've seen that in public opinion polls. We've seen that in the rise of climate change-related litigation cases. We've seen that in campaigns like Fridays for Future, climate strikes, as well as the Race to Zero campaign, which touches on non-state actor action. But despite this, we are not guaranteed a consensus in host communities for wind projects, especially at the pace of change that we're calling for. Many stakeholders, from scholars to policymakers to those of us in the industry, are expressing increasing concern that social media is enabling a surge in misinformation or even disinformation regarding climate change and regarding wind energy in particular. Typically, climate change misinformation has focused on denialism, denying that climate change exists or denying that it's induced by human actions. But recent research is suggesting that the current picture is more complicated, and the category of climate misinformation should also include skepticism, denial, contrarianism, and even climate defeatism. In the vein of, it's too late, the window has closed, what can we do about it now? As wind energy continues to expand into new markets, new geographies, into new communities in mature markets, disinformation could foster opposition from marginal interests, opposition from displaced workers, from sunset industries and fossil fuel sectors or adjacent sectors to fossil fuels, and this could slow down deployment and worsen social acceptance for wind. So this session is really about understanding a bit more about disinformation, the sources, the types of messages that are proliferating online and offline, and what the industry can do about it to combat disinformation. I'd like to now welcome onto the stage, so to speak, our virtual speaker, and while he's coming online, I'll introduce our physical speaker here. So we have Roman Rudnick, who is the communications advisor of the German Wind Energy Association, or BWE. And Roman's going to tell us a little bit more about how disinformation is affecting the wind industry in Germany, which has faced a softer period for growth, let's say, in the last few years, but now has a new coalition government with aggressive targets to grow wind energy, including off the back of their Easter package released yesterday. And we're also joined by Joe Ondrick, who is head of investigations at a company called Logically. Welcome to the stage, Joe. I believe you have a presentation for us to just set the stage a little bit, give us more context about disinformation and climate change. I'll hand it to you to introduce yourself and Logically and tell us about disinformation.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Let me just share my slides. Okay, so that should be working. I can see it on the screen here. So a little bit about myself and a little bit about Logically first. I am head of investigations here at Logically. So what that means is my role is involved in tracking disinformation in terms of narratives, in terms of actors, and in terms of messages that then gain a foothold and gain prevalence within wider online discourse. We deal with all kinds of mis and disinformation, so that's we've got our hands tied pretty heavily with the situation in Ukraine at the moment. We've published heavily on climate change and done a lot of research into various aspects of climate disinformation and where that might be coming from. We've tackled COVID disinformation, both in terms of vaccine stances and in terms of COVID denialism. And we also do a lot of work combating conspiracy theories and how they lead to extremism and other potential offline flashpoints. So Logically itself, we are a tech company. We tackle harmful and problematic online content, like I said, disinformation, misinformation, influence campaigns, conspiracy theories, and other topics that deal in those kind of areas. We have a suite of products to help people navigate the online world as it is, with the high amount of information, both good and bad, that is shared. So we have a web app. We have our flagship monitoring tool, which is called Logically AI, Logically Intelligence. And Logically Intelligence is a large monitoring platform to monitor the narratives and the threats that may come with various forms of mis and disinformation. That uses AI and natural language processing, along with human intelligence and expertise from me and my team, to help curate and bring these situations together. We were founded in 2017, based out of Leeds in the north of the UK, and we have grown significantly in the past year with offices in the US, the UK, and India. So that's a little bit about Logically, a little bit about myself. Today, I would like to talk to you about one of the areas where I think once you dig down into climate disinformation, this could potentially be a serious flashpoint, and that is climate change in the context of contemporary conspiracy movements. So what I want to do is introduce the concept of the cultic milieu, which is a bedrock concept around conspiracy movements online and how it relates to contemporary conspiracy movements, to show how climate change and green energy messaging fits into these frameworks and the worldview that these conspiracies cultivate, and to flag potential future risk vectors in this field. So where are the potential problems going to be as green energy rollout continues? So, defining the post-COVID and post-Q cultic milieu. So the cultic milieu is a term developed by a professor called Professor Colin Campbell. It's a sociological term, and it describes a cognitive space where all deviant belief systems can coexist. So everything from alien abduction beliefs to complementary alternative medicine, flat earthers, they all have a home in the cultic milieu. And it's an open space where people can try on different beliefs and try on different areas to see what can fit their own personal worldviews. Prior to the internet, and indeed up until about up until the 21st century, the cultic milieu was the sign of a relatively healthy society where people were able to enjoy these ideas, to try these things on, to sort of explore what could be considered forbidden or arcane knowledge with very little risk in terms of offline harm. However, two things happened in the past 5 or 6 years that have seriously changed the way the cultic milieu works and changed the dynamics. First of all, we have QAnon. Now, I'm sure everyone here knows what QAnon is. It was the conspiracy theory involving Donald Trump and the stolen election and the idea that the Hollywood elites are operating a cabal of Satanists and they run the world essentially. So it's a meta conspiracy. Q has since stopped posting. But the belief system of QAnon has been exported internationally and has been flexible enough to adapt to local variations in what we call narrative localization. It is also a meta-conspiracy. So the larger tip of the iceberg of QAnon is that there are secret societies that run the world and they have a hand in all global events. And this meta-conspiracy plugged into existing conspiracies, but also changed the dynamics of the cultic milieu in a way in which that by being explicitly political, QAnon shifted the cultic milieu to a more active and online and relatively right-wing leaning social space. Over the past 2 years as well, we have the pandemic, and conspiracy theories around the pandemic have plugged into the cultic milieu and have plugged into QAnon beliefs in quite an explicit way. So early on, with the research that we've been doing, we found that COVID disinformation focused on anti-COVID vax rather than anti-vax. So this was the idea that it plugs into COVID denialism. There was a lot of, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but this particular vaccine, for example, isn't a real vaccine. COVID doesn't exist. So you end up with COVID denialism, much in the same way that you end up with climate denialism. Policy communications and opacity around our understanding of COVID, of vaccine rollouts, of prior history with big pharma companies and their, less than perfect track record when it comes to ethics, have all had an effect and all brought an uptake in COVID conspiracy theories. These then onboarded people into the wider cultic milieu where they started believing in QAnon and QAnon adjacent conspiracy theories. And this is where we get to this idea that the secret societies that run the world have a huge impact. And you can start to see where this leans into climate as the next front for these kind of conspiracy and disinformation campaigns to run. So their beliefs, I just gave a quick rundown, but to be a little bit more complex with it, there is a lot going on here. So as I said, the cultic milieu is a free mix of beliefs. There are a lot of different things that go that combine in there, from alien abductions, flat earthers, Area 51 believers, 9/11 truthers. It's a free space where deviant belief systems and knowledge that isn't socially accepted exists, and people can explore and try on different hats and remix these beliefs into their own personal belief system that aligns with other people's. So it's easier then to think about these things as the cultic milieu as a bedrock for these beliefs rather than getting into the minutiae, because you could be lost doing that. So at its core, we can characterize the existing online cultic milieu as a place that has a shared suspicion of orthodoxies. And that is a tendency to reject the status quo in the form of scientists, medical professionals, government, or pharmaceutical companies. This study was conducted on complementary alternative medicine. But the same can be said if we have energy companies in there, green energy think tanks, and this then takes the form of conspiracy ideation. So what we have are people who essentially build a robust framework that begins to reject scientific messaging or messaging from the status quo. So where does green energy and climate change fit in? It's quite well linked. So people in this field, myself included, who have been monitoring the narratives of climate disinformation and the cultic milieu and disinformation in general, have noticed that the white papers for sustainability and for climate targets and other ways of shifting global energy production, even if it's in passing in another larger white paper, have been co-opted by the cultic milieu as indicators of more sinister and ulterior motives. So Agenda 21 as a hashtag, if you search that and you explore the narratives and conversations in there, very much conspiracy driven. The same goes for Agenda 2030. And at this point, the Great Reset is as much a stand-in for a meta-conspiracy as it is the World Economic Forum's white paper. So coordinated movements towards green and sustainable technologies are instantly met with suspicion because they are part of these white papers, which they also characterize as a sinister plot to control the population to an extent. So here is a graph from a study we conducted into the Great Reset and sub-narratives therein. This isn't, like I said, this isn't a solid categorization of what goes into the Great Reset. The nature of the cultic milieu makes that quite difficult. However, we've broken it down into dominant strands here. Now, the dotted lines are other areas. COVID and vaccines have obviously dominated the discourse. Sadly, explicit anti-Semitism has been on the rise. However, I'll draw your eyes to the solid line here, which is climate change. Now, the spikes here are around specific events and the release of specific papers and studies. The large spike here is due to the COP26 conference. However, what is concerning is the gradual and sustained rise from the baseline as we move into a post-COVID era where people are trying to move back to normal. The other forms of social change begin to become the new hot button that is leveraged in the cultic milieu. So what are the risks of this? We have thought-terminating epistemology. So this suspicion of orthodoxy and this suspicion of experts, of traditional areas where people would often think of good information to come from, is easy to dismiss. So the way in which the worldview and that epistemological framework for viewing the world functions shutters out traditionally accepted forms of authoritative and good information. Another risk is through outside influence. So the contemporary cultic milieu has demonstrated itself as a group that is very easily activated by outside forces. People who've been following disinformation campaigns around the crisis in Ukraine will have easily noted that Russian media and Russian state actors have been pushing a biolabs conspiracy theory, which, whilst existing before COVID, this idea of biolabs in Ukraine, it was a more native Russian conspiracy theory. They have done so now, linking it to topics that they know will the cultic milieu would be sympathetic to. So we are post-COVID. There is a large swathe of people who are COVID denialists who believe that it might be a bioweapon. And Russia is pushing this message out there, knowing that they have a loud and active sympathetic ear in the West. Gender critical narratives as well is another area where the cultic milieu has been activated to artificially raise a issue into prominence due to active posting. looping back to Russia as well as legacy industry initiatives. Russia Today have posted significantly on Western initiatives to switch to wind power in the past, and pushed narratives around wind energy not actually being a sustainable or green form of energy. Coatless and Cato Institute's narrative laundering websites have also done similar things. Now, these are the parts where the messaging and the beliefs can leak outside of the cultic milieu and have more of a mainstream uptake. But much like the Russian biolabs conspiracy theory, the cultic milieu is much more immediately receptive to these ideas. And another area of concern is on-ramps for extremism. The cultic milieu is a space where extremists can bring people in and to recruit them into more extreme beliefs. As mentioned on the narrative slide, we have anti-Semitism as a large factor there. Beyond that as well, we had the vandalists, the vandals who vandalized 5G towers during the COVID pandemic, and we could see similar actions happening potentially as a green energy rollout increases. So I'm going to wrap up there. This is just a quick QR code to register interest in our threat platform. We are putting together some curated rooms where interested parties can explore the narratives that I've talked about a bit here, how they impact the wider information space. It also allows you to download our COP26 climate disinformation report as well. So I will leave this up for a little bit, and I will finish talking here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joe. You're not with us physically, but I can confirm several smartphones were raised in the air to scan that QR code. I think that link is appreciated. And I'm very proud that we've hosted the only graph at the conference to chart climate against aliens. Maybe not the last. So I'd like to open this up into a conversation format now. We can't have this session without engaging a public audience as well. So if you do have a question, I'll get us started, but if you have a question, please raise your hand. We have a roving mic that can reach you, and I'll just keep scanning. That's available. I'd like to start maybe with you, Roman, on what you're seeing in the German wind industry. What sort of disinformation messages have you been seeing in Germany, and how has this impacted the industry? Over to you.
All right, thank you, Joyce. Good morning to everyone. Yeah, misinformation is definitely a problem in the German wind industry, although I would say the main issues are still permitting and on a national, federal level that we have to address. But misinformation is definitely an issue which affects the regional level when it comes to implementing actual projects within a community or so. It's mostly in that context that so-called infamous NIMBY problem arises, and a small number of people, for whatever more legitimate or less legitimate reason, opposes the actual problem. And what we saw in recent years is that there are, so to say, networks who are investing into take advantage of these individuals on a local level and enforce their protests, and are really giving them out information, material, support them in organizing protests, or create a citizens initiative, collecting signatures against the projects. And there's been some very interesting investigations in that, which concluded, or there are hints that these networks or organizations can be traced back or linked to the fossil fuels industry. There's just some very few individuals, like lawyers, or another guy is even working in the or was working for the Ministry of Economic Affairs, who are very active in the scene, so to say, and in these associations which they want to make, or which they want to seem like a grassroots movement by like taking advantage of people on a local level who oppose wind energy projects. It's not a major problem that we see, but as I said, like on a regional, local level in certain areas, it is definitely affecting the expansion of wind energy.
Interesting. I think to provide some more color for our audience, and we've brought in COVID, we've brought in biolabs and other issues, just to really hone in on some of the messages that we do see on disinformation, wind energy. I'm going to do the thing that we're not supposed to do, which is to relay some of these messages with a 5-second disinformation warning. So some of the messages that we have picked up on: wind turbines don't work, they're inefficient, wind turbines use more energy than they produce, they're more expensive than fossil fuels, they need an equivalent amount of fossil fuels to use as generation backup power, and therefore they carry hidden costs. They have a negative effect on biodiversity. We saw this message particularly play out, and we're seeing it play out in the French election campaign. Wind turbines are a major source of bird deaths. They use large amounts of fossil fuels to keep spinning. They create more emissions in the supply chain than they remove from the energy systems. They create large amounts of waste, and they create massive environmental damage due to mining of minerals used in wind turbines. These messages can be widely rebutted using available LCOE numbers, using scientific data and consensus from the IPCC reports, market data which reflects the impact on power prices and generation output in energy systems. But the wide availability of such evidence and information does not stop disinformation from circulating. So I think with that, maybe Joe, we can turn back to you and probe a little bit on where you're seeing disinformation regarding renewable energy pick up in particular. Which countries in particular do these messages tend to proliferate? And what sort of messages are you picking up in those countries or regions?
Of course. So there is a distinct divide we've noticed between Western and developed countries and developing countries in terms of the nature of the messaging that is being targeted towards them. Disinformation targeting developed countries, European countries, Western countries is very much, as you said there, Joyce. It's a lot of tried and tested narratives that, whilst we can debunk them, still find a serious foothold. In developing countries, we've noticed that the messaging leans quite heavily on the material costs and the environmental costs of implementing and developing green energy. So it's more messaging based on the initial manufacture and the initial creation of the infrastructure for green renewable energy.
Thanks, Joe. I just want to check again if we have any questions from the audience before turning to one last question. So we have one in the front row. The microphone is coming your way.
Hi, Ian Griggs from Wind Power Monthly here. I'm just wondering, do you feel that the lobbyists that you alluded to in the fossil fuel industry are better funded than the wind industry? And does that concern you? Does the wind industry need its own kind of armory of a better kind of public affairs output or lobbyists?
Are you directing your question to
you
anyone?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you like to start?
Yes, certainly. All right, the tone is there. I'm working for the German Wind Association, and we are doing our best to combat and to tackle these misinformations. The research or the investigations that I mentioned were done by, there was a very interesting one from Greenpeace, and there's also a very large book on the matter, which was published by a journalist and a climate activist last year, about these, that I mentioned, like the structures and associations who are spreading like this, these misinformations. I think we're doing our best to act on the matter, and if we see something problematic in the media, especially like on the mainstream media, not so much on the local level, we address that issue. I just remember a few weeks ago there were some reports about the use of balsa wood, implying that for like fostering the wind energy here in Europe, the rainforest basically in South America is teared down, and there's some massive environmental problems. And investigating in that research, we like published a paper on the matter. Turned out it's just simply not true. Europe is only responsible for like 12% of the imports of balsa wood, and all the European producers that we contacted already made sure years ago that this wood is only coming from sustainable sourcing. So yeah.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, do you need to scale up your own communications as an industry, as a wind industry, in order to combat this? Do you need to fund that better?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think it sounds like more of a suggestion than a question. I would agree, but I would extend this to say it's not just about having deep pockets for communications and for public affairs work. I think it's about having a wide enough aperture about the different macroeconomic challenges and market challenges that are on the horizon, short-term and long-term. We've heard a lot about commodity price fluctuations and cost inflation in the upstream supply chain at this conference, which is an area that the oil and gas sector kind of wired up for cyclical growth and high capex projects that they're very well resourced to prepare for. They have teams of analysts that study price fluctuations, study commodities on a regular basis, and that look at macroeconomic, political, commercial, legal, and other forms of risk when they're looking at their market entry opportunities. I'm not sure the wind industry has such a sophisticated set of tools at the moment, but certainly I think if we are going to become the mainstream energy source for the global power sector, and by any count of net zero roadmaps and Paris compliant pathways, we'll be providing around 1/3 of global electricity by 2050. We need to get smart.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ian.
Also, if I may add, I think these networks and what I mentioned, like this seemingly grassroots movement, it's a strategy, it's a tactic, and I don't think really that it's desirable for the wind industry to engage in a counter campaign and use the same strategy against fossil fuels or whatsoever. What is the phenomenon is that these misinformations and accusations are there, and even though there's very few people who are fostering that or believing that, it is affecting, so to say, the mainstream media. And what we do is, obviously, if there's serious or reasonable media concern, just like in the case with balsa wood now, we obviously address that. But yeah, playing it dirty, I don't think it will play to our advantage in the long way.
That's interesting. I think in communications, we've all heard this line of don't feed the trolls, but exactly. Is that going to be enough of a line of defense against wide-scale disinformation? An interesting question to think about. We have one more question from the audience. Please keep it to just one question, and then maybe we can hand it to Joe to answer this one.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Alex, I'm from Wind Europe, so sustainability manager, a very interesting topic. My question is related to the same topic, and it's directed to Joe, actually, so maybe you can answer my question at the same time when he answers the previous one, which is where we see where disinformation is spreading actively. There's also an anti-authoritarian sentiment. So when lobbying as a wind industry or any other source, which type of authority could actually be the one that actively rebuts and can have a sense of authority within those, let's say, disinformation communities? And how do we break that or break into that group going forward?
It's quite a difficult phenomenon to try and address on the basis that a lot of the fringe groups are by and large going to reject any mainstream source of authoritative knowledge on the matter. There is the cliche of rejecting mainstream media. There is the wholesale rejection of scientists who are in the pocket of whatever industry, ironically the green industry being one of them, and the rejection of sort of any sort of widespread messaging campaign to sort of break through to this small but loud and active group. What I think could be an advantage, but again, it has one foot in this area of playing it dirty, which we don't necessarily want to do, is because of the wide expanse of belief systems and narratives that inform the cultic milieu and inform these fringe groups, there are those who end up leaning into this sort of mindset from what would initially have been a green and sort of more spiritual and more sympathetic to the planet sort of mindset. So there is a known pathway in disinformation and conspiracy research from yoga groups through to believing in New World Order conspiracies. But these tend to be the people who are more attuned and more sensitive to green issues. It's the same groups of people. There's a large overlap with the veganism community as well. So whilst we will never win over the entire fringe conspiracy network, we'll never win over the cultic milieu. That's an impossibility by the very definition of how they exist. But there may be areas where there are sympathetic ears within this larger group, and appealing to those who are more sensitive to issues around green energy, around the earth as an ecological system, rather than those who are already fully down the road of conspiracy theories and New World Orders. That might be a way to begin to siphon people off the slippery slope, out of the rabbit hole, towards a wholesale rejection of all scientists and known and respected knowledge, and sort of bring them, at least in a certain sense, towards an acceptance of a green energy transition.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you, Alex, for your question. I'm just going to slightly reframe the question and give the last word to Roman here in terms of what we as citizens and as an industry can do to combat misinformation and disinformation on wind energy.
As of from the perspective of my association, it is stick to the facts, stick to the truth. And so far, what we see, all the issues of misinformation that we faced in the past turned out to be not true. For example, as I can think of now, is the birds issue, like that wind energy or wind turbines are shredding birds. It has been an accusation for years for the wind industry in Germany, and up until the year 2019, where the national birds, the official national birds report from the Ministry of Environment was published, and turned out that all these birds who are supposedly affected by wind energy, like rare birds, eagles and all that sort of stuff, had a positive development. Like overall, they had gains in the number of species. They're not endangered anymore. And what can I say? What better proof is there than a large wind energy expansion in Germany, and at the same time, all the rare birds turn out to grow in their amount and are not endangered anymore. It's just Great. Facts, and we can make sure to publish that.
So I think sticking to the facts, arming yourself with evidence, monitoring the situation so you have new and compelling evidence, and building support among a compelling mainstream as ways to combat disinformation. I think we're on borrowed time, so I'm going to start to close down this session with a final word that GWEC has just published its Global Wind Report 2022 with a section on disinformation as a potential societal challenge or enabler to wind energy. We address many of the issues, not the cultic milieu as a phrase, but many of the issues we've spoken about today in the report, including the ClimateGate scandal in 2009, which was one of the factors that derailed the Copenhagen 2009 COP conference, as well as the case of disinformation around the Texas freeze crisis in early last year. So please download a copy of the Global Wind Report, come to the GUX stand afterwards and speak to us a little bit more about this topic, and arm yourselves. I think that's one of the main takeaways. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Joe, thank you to Roman.